Botswana is one of the most beautiful and wildest countries in Africa, and it's certainly my favorite one to self-drive in. But I tell you what, if you don't plan your trip properly, it can quickly turn into a nightmare. And that's why I thought in this video I'll share with you some of my top tips to help you have the perfect self-drive trip through Botswana. Now, for those of you that watch the channel, you'll know that I go to Botswana regularly to visit those beautiful wild game reserves, to see the animals and take some photographs as well. So what I'll do at the end of the video, I'll link to some of those videos so that you can go and see exactly how I do it. But before I share the tips with you, make sure to order a book called Botswana Self-Drive Routes, Roads and Ratings, which is definitely the best book to help you plan a Botswana trip. I've linked to that at the top of the video description, and if you use that link, you'll receive a 10% discount as well. I'll talk a little bit more about this book later in this video. So let's get straight on to my first tip. The first tip is you've got to go the right time of the year. Botswana is basically a desert system, and that means that it's got extreme temperatures. So if you don't like the heat, stay away from October through to March when it gets extremely hot. And if you don't like the cold, stay away in June, July and August when it can get freezing at night. You also have to be a little bit careful of the rainy season, which could be anything from November all the way through to April. Because when it rains a lot, you can very easily get stuck in very thick mud in certain game reserves. So if you're a little bit worried about water crossings, muddy terrain, and simply raining out on your self-drive and safari, rather stick to the winter months, basically from May all the way through to October. And then it's also very important to avoid the South African school holidays. Now those terms change every year, so I recommend that you just do a Google search and check for the specific year that you're planning to go to Botswana. And especially stay away during the Easter holidays, which is usually in March or April, or the winter holidays, which are in June and July. My second tip is you must go long enough when you self-drive in Botswana. A lot of people only give themselves a week to 10 days and they rush through the country and they never get a chance to see the best places for long enough. So I would recommend that you go for at least 2 weeks, but preferably 3 weeks to a month. Now, when you go to Botswana, you might be tempted to cross at the closest border post to Johannesburg, where you might pick up a rental car, and that would be Martin's Drift border post. But that one can be very, very busy because there's only one lane over the bridge that crosses the Limpopo River, and you could get stuck there for up to 3 hours. So what I recommend is change your route a little bit and cross at one of the many other smaller border posts. There are often no people there when you get there, and it makes it extremely quick to cross. So a big mistake that a lot of people make is they fill up their tanks on the South African side before they cross over to Botswana. But there are petrol stations right across the country in all the big towns. And guess what? It's actually cheaper on the Botswana side than it is in South Africa. So I recommend that you fill up on the Botswana side, and especially those jerry cans that you plan to fill up if you're going into very remote areas. Towns like Palape, Francistown, Nata or Maun are all good places to get your petrol or diesel. Do however make sure that you take enough extra fuel with if you're planning to do a lot of game drives in areas like Moremi, Chobe, Savuti or Kwai, or deep into the central Kalahari. Another thing that you've got to do is to plan your shopping days carefully. Now the reason for this is a lot of products are not allowed into Botswana. Things like meat and some vegetables and milk and other dairy products. And that means you might have to shop once you're inside Botswana. Now luckily, again, the bigger towns do have good grocery stores, but sometimes you might have to drive around a little bit to find exactly what you're looking for. So you might be buying certain cuts of meat here, some vegetables there, and pick up milk in another place. And that just means you might need more time than you think. So make sure you visit those larger towns like Francistown, Maun or Gaborone during the weekdays and give yourself at least one night there so that you have more than enough time to do all your shopping. Now, speaking about enough time, this is probably my most important tip, and that is to try and stay longer in one place rather than short periods of time in many different places. I see so many Botswana itineraries that go basically Kamarina Sanctuary one night, Kubo Island one night, Maun one night, Moremi, all the different camps one night, across to Kwai for a night, Savuti one night, Chobe one night, and even though it's a nice 2-week-long trip, all you're basically doing is driving, unpacking, packing everything up, driving again, and you never get an opportunity to really enjoy a game reserve or national park. So I always suggest when you go to Botswana, if you only have 2 weeks, maybe choose 3 destinations. Kubu Island, Naipans, and maybe the Mahadi Pans. Or Moremi, Kwai, and Savuti. But don't try and do everything in one trip. Rather spend quality time in just a few places and come back in another year to visit the places you didn't have time to see. I typically stay at least 2 nights in places like Kubu Island, where there's maybe not so much to see, and up to a week in places where there's lots of areas to drive and plenty to see, like Moremi, Kwai, Savuti, or the Chobe River. And even if you go to places like the Central Kalahari, where there's plenty of campsites to choose from, don't feel under pressure to visit every single campsite. Rather choose 1 or 2 and spend some quality time there, because that allows you to really get to know what happens in that area and gives you a chance to go back if you find something really nice, like a hyena den or a beautiful waterhole. And that's the great thing about this Botswana self-drive book. It actually tells you which campsites are best in each game reserve. Now, speaking about campsites, it can be a little bit daunting to make all your bookings because you don't necessarily always know who is in charge of each campsite. And sometimes it might be a privately owned campsite, but the park is run by government. So it's 2 different places that you need to pay. So a top tip is to use a booking agent if you want to make your Botswana self-drive bookings. And I can highly recommend a company called DriveBots, which I've used before, and I'll link to them in the video description. And they'll basically put the whole trip together for you. It means you've just got one place to pay, and they'll make all those bookings for you and help you with your itinerary. And in the case of Drive Botswana, they can also help you get the perfect rental car, which is obviously super important in Botswana. When it comes to driving, you've got to make sure that you get your distances right every day. A big mistake that people make in Botswana is they try and drive way too far every single day. So rather keep the distances short, maybe 500 kilometers or less. And once you're in the game reserves, keep that even shorter, because I promise you, it takes a lot longer to drive a thick sandy road than you might think. So don't, for instance, try and get from a third bridge in Moremi all the way to the Chobe River. It's just too far to cover that distance. Rather break it up by spending a night or 2 in Kwai and in Savuti, and that way you're never going to get rushed and you're never going to be stuck after dark. And that brings us to the next tip. Never ever drive after dark in Botswana. Now that shouldn't happen if you do what I suggested before by keeping your distances short, but sometimes people, for some strange reason, just leave way too late to get to their next campsite. Or they get kind of sidetracked game viewing or taking photographs and they end up arriving after dark. And the problem in Botswana is there are so many animals on the road. It'll be wildlife and game reserves, or it could be things like donkeys and cows on the tar roads. And these animals really do make the roads extremely dangerous. The amount of accidents you see when you drive on the Botswana highways is actually quite staggering. So do everything you can to avoid driving after dark, because again, it's such a remote country. If you do have an accident, it might be difficult to get some help. It really is all about safety in Botswana. And that brings me to 4x4 driving. My next tip is really try and do everything you can to avoid tough 4x4 driving. Yes, you might need a 4x4 in certain areas, but if you can, try and avoid getting stuck. I see so many people that purposefully try and take the tough roads or the wet roads or the muddy roads or the sandy roads just to have some fun in their cars, and then they either get stuck or they even break down, and it really can ruin a trip. Not only because you get stuck in the heat, or you might get dehydrated or bump into a wild animal, but also because you might lose some days on the trip that then has a very bad knock-on effect. If you see a water crossing, don't cross if you don't absolutely have to. Ideally, you should walk through first to see how deep it is and not go through if it looks by any means dangerous. But the problem with that is that there are often crocodiles around, so you do take a big risk walking into any water. So what I typically do when I get to a water crossing is I think to myself, is it absolutely necessary to cross? If not, I'll take a detour. And if I do need to cross there, I'll actually wait for another vehicle to arrive, and preferably a game viewer from one of the local lodges where the guides know the line to take through the water. And that way, you give yourself a better chance to cross a water crossing. You've got to be extremely careful in muddy conditions, because when you get stuck there, you could be stuck for days. And that's why I typically don't like traveling to Botswana during the wet months. So that's typically December, January, February, and March. When it comes to sand, there's sand right throughout Botswana, and it's highly unlikely that you won't hit some thick sand at some stage if you self-drive extensively through Botswana. But a top tip, the sand is typically harder and more compact early in the mornings when it's nice and cool, so that would be your least chance of getting stuck. If you drive towards the middle of the day when it's hot, the sand gets very loose and becomes very easy to get stuck. So what you can also do is to deflate your tire pressure. Now you've got to be careful with some tires to not deflate it too much, but typically I take it down to say 1.5 bar or even all the way down to 1 bar if it's very thick sand. But then immediately afterwards, when I'm out of that situation, I'll inflate it again. But it is important to have a compressor with you so that you can do that if it's necessary. And if you do get into trouble, it definitely helps to have a satellite phone with you. It just means you can call for help from anywhere in the country. And remember, most of Botswana has 0 signal, especially in the game reserves. So I typically rent my satellite phone from a company called Sat4Rent, and I've used them for over 15 years, and they've only ever given me amazing service. So I'll link to them in the video description as well. Something else that can give you real peace of mind is knowing exactly where you are. So I highly recommend that you take a GPS with, one that you put in the front of the dash, and that you load the newest version of Tracks for Africa on it. Again, I'll link to that in the video description. Now, Tracks for Africa is basically just a piece of software that's better than your normal sat-nav. It has all the back roads on it, and it'll give you the exact distances to get to your campsite. And it also makes it a little bit easier when you get to a game reserve and you don't know exactly where, say, campsite number 1 or 3 or 15 is. It's going to save you a lot of time and give you a lot of peace of mind to know exactly where you are all the time. Now, the main reason that I go to Botswana, and I know that's the same reason for you, is to go and look for animals. Now, I see a lot of people make the mistake to do their game drives during the wrong times of the day. They'll do drives during the middle of the day when it's very hot and most of the animals are basically sleeping. Now, I think one of the reasons for this is something I touched on earlier, where people only stay one night. It means that they are so tired when they wake up in the morning, and it means they've got to pack up their camp to head on to the next campsite. And that means they can't actually use those first few hours in the day when game viewing is at its best. So if you stay 2 or more nights in one place, it gives you the opportunity to do game drives early in the morning and late in the afternoon. And that's the golden rule in any game reserve. It's always going to give you a chance to see animals that are active, and it's best for photography. Now, to get yourself excited about Botswana, or even to ask questions that are answered very quickly, also check out the DriveBots Facebook page. I'll link to that in the video description. It's an amazing community of people like us that just love traveling and self-driving. And if you have any question about anything in Botswana, ask it on the DriveBots page, and a few people will answer you within a day. Now, last but by no means least, I want to mention again this amazing book called Botswana Self-Drive: Routes, Roads and Ratings. It's part of a series by HPH Publishing that covers different areas in game reserves. So there's Kruger Self-Drive, Kalahari Self-Drive, Pilanesberg Self-Drive, and also Botswana Self-Drive. And it contains detailed information about each and every game reserve and park in Botswana. So for instance, if you're planning to go to Moremi or Kwai or the Chobe National Park or the Central Kalahari, it tells you which campsites to visit, how to book them. It has detailed maps of every single area and then suggested routes and also some advice in terms of what you can expect to see there. It has information about the seasons, driving distances, and it even has bird, tree and animal lists at the back so you can tick off what you've seen throughout your self-drive in Botswana. Like I mentioned before, if you use the link at the top of the video description to order this book online, you'll get a 10% discount when you check out. I really hope that these tips help you and that you have an amazing self-drive trip to Botswana. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments down below. I also want to use this opportunity to thank each and every one of my patrons. These are the people that support my channel by making a small monthly donation. I really appreciate you guys, and if any of you that watch this video now would like to become a patron, simply follow the link that I've added in the video description. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to go and check out some of my overlanding series to which I'll link to now. Until next time.